This is the Lockpicker 1969, and welcome to my channel, and welcome to another episode of Challenge Lock Workshop. Today, I thought I'd get into making spools and serrated spools, but basic spools, pretty much. What I'm going to go through is a number of videos showing exactly how to make a standard spool, a double spool, a barrel, a barrel and a barrel spool, as well as a serrated spool and a double serrated spool, or a double spool that's been serrated. Anyways, essentially, I'm going to go through each one of these and show how I made each one of them. So in each video, each section, you'll see a video in the upper right hand corner that shows the actual pin being made, and then a picture of the pin in the lower left hand corner, and then I'll explain what I'm doing with the pin throughout that process. Please enjoy. Okay, so here are some of the tools that I'm going to be using to make some spools. I start out usually with a round file to essentially start an indentation in the brass rod so that I can essentially get that started. Once that groove has started, I can then take a pillar file and lay it into where that mark was made, and it'll file deeper into the metal and actually square it off, and then I can move it side to side in order to widen the spool however I like. I use this file here when I first start spinning just to smooth out any rough edges that are on the rod stock and make the end a nice smooth end on there. And then of course sandpaper. Once I'm all finished making and shaping the pin I want, I use the sandpaper to smooth everything out and polish it up nice. I'll go through that a little bit as well and explain that during the demo videos. When we get to making serrations in spools, I do use a hacksaw blade to make a little wider serration on them. You can also use what's called a kerf saw, or a Japanese style type pull saw. This is 0.01 inches, so it's extremely thin. It can make some very fine serrations, but you basically lay it on there and you can put your serration exactly where you want it on your pin that you're making. And then finally, the jeweler saw, so that I can cut the pin free once I'm done working on it. So those are the tools that I use to work on spools and other pins, but for this demonstration, spools. Okay, so basic spools are probably one of the easiest pins to make. I start out by using a large flat file to smooth off the end, get rid of any burrs from when I cut the rod stock free from a longer section of rod stock. And at some point I will work on the actual edges to make sure there's no burrs on that either. We don't want that snagging in the lock at any point. We want a nice smooth pin that can move through the channel without an issue. But I will work at that just a little bit to make it nice and polished. I then move to a round file, and I want to make a channel in there. And the intention here is to create a channel that I can then switch to a pillar file and start working on creating a much deeper channel into that pin to use, to make a spool out of it. So once I have an established channel, I'll switch to the round file, and I'm using the pillar file. I'm using the edge of the pillar file to get into that groove that I just made. And it will skip at first, but once you get in there, it'll start to kind of eat, into the pin a bit, which is what you want. I do use the edge of the pillar file, and I put that against either side of the channel to sharpen that up and make it a nice crisp channel that can get stuck in threading and so forth much better. I do. You can make this channel as wide or as narrow as you like, but obviously if it's too narrow, it's not really a spool anymore. It's more of a serrated pin. But anyway, I do switch to sandpaper. You can do 400 grit. I tend to use 400 and 600 grit to polish up the pin and really get it. I do try to get into the channel that I have just made. I want to smooth this out and polish it up. That's really the intent here. So once it's polished up, it's ready to be cut free from the pin. And I essentially use a jeweler's saw. And what's really important here to know about using the jeweler's saw to cut this pin free that when you feel it's ready and it's done is you have to very closely eyeball exactly where you want that to be. It does tend to want to skip around at first, but once it actually digs in a bit, then you can apply a little bit more pressure and actually a sawing motion, a light sawing motion. Don't put too much pressure because it will snap your blade, but once you break that free, you're in good shape. Then on to making a double spool. Same thing, I'm smoothing out the end to get rid of any burrs and get rid of anything that might cause it to snag in the lock. And once I'm ready to do that, I'm going to very carefully choose 2 different spots that I want to create my channels. So in the video there, I'm just finishing up getting the edges done, and then we'll switch to the round file. So I lay the round file on the endmost piece that I want to create a channel on first. And I just need that channel deep enough. Now, be mindful, you're going to eat some material to either side of that channel. So make sure you're giving yourself enough room. So I'm lying the pillar file on the channel I created. And I apologize. I was doing this video work from behind the camera. So normally I have the files that I'm using at much more of a perpendicular, which is what you want. I was a little bit more of an angle because I couldn't see very well behind a camera. But so I'm making the channel on the end where I'm going to want that. Once I've started a channel there, I will then create the second groove where I'd like to create my second channel to make the double spool. So there I'm making the actual groove that I intend to make another channel on. And then I'll lay the pillar file onto that and let it start to eat into that. Now I do tend to, once I've got the file doing its job, I will bring the file back and forth to help it remove more material a little bit quicker. You can take your time on this. It's not a rush. It's not a race. So you want to make these things the way you want. So once I've actually brought the 2 channels the way I want them, you can make them as deep or as narrow as you like, but I use the sandpaper again to polish everything off. I make sure that I sand into the channels themselves so that they're nice and finished as well. And then essentially I finish up using the sandpaper when I'm pretty comfortable with how smooth it looks. And then essentially I'll move to the jeweler saw to cut it free. And again, you have to be careful where you put that down and let it start eating, because once it starts eating, that's where you're going to be doing your cut. So again, being perfectly perpendicular helps, and once you start to feel it eat in, you can give it a back and forth sawing motion, and it'll help remove the pin. Now, for barrels and barrel spool pins, there's 2 different kinds. There's barrels and there's barrel spool pins. With the barrel spool pins, there's a little different approach and look to them, whereas a barrel looks just like what it sounds, like a barrel. So you're creating essentially 2 grooves and a center portion of the pin. So the channels actually don't have an outside portion of the pin. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating the layout for how I want my two channels to be. Now the channels will be on the outsides with one larger like ring on the inside, and when it's finished it should look like a barrel. So I will then take those two channels I made in the rod stock while it's spinning, and essentially the next thing here is to apply the pillar file, and I'll apply that to the channels I created. And what I'm attempting to do here is just file down some of what's on the end to match the channel a little bit better that I started on the end of the rod stock. Once I start seeing that it's starting to even out and I'm happy with the way that's looking, I will move to the other side and start working on that other channel. And what I'm really going for here is a nice even, I go for symmetrical, but you could make either channel whatever size you want. You want a barrel that is thicker on one end and thin on the other? Hey, knock yourself out. Make the barrel the way you want. But I will go back and forth between the two sides until I'm happy with what I'm seeing, and it is essentially the pin is going to be the way I want it to look and the way I want it to function. At this point, I'm going to put the sandpaper to finish it off, polish it up, and basically get ready to cut it. Now, I can't emphasize enough that smoothing out both sides is very important for a barrel to work properly and do what it's intended to do. Then it's time to cut the barrel free. Now, I'm going to note here that in cutting this barrel off, the jeweler saw did skip on me, and I did not catch that right away, and it made a very, very minor serration on the end. But that's what pin making is all about, is you have trial and error, and you just go back and do it again, make another pin and make it the way so it's perfect, I guess. But yep, there goes. That's a barrel. Then a barrel spool, from what I see and what I use, is really, to me, similar to a double spool. What it has in it is a very large mid section and some decent sized channels that you're making on either side of that midsection. And in this case, I wanted to make a barrel spool that had very thin ends on it, which would act like catching on the serrations, catching on the threads in the channel, if possible, to make it a bit more of a challenge to work with. So I made the groove with the round file. Now I'm following that up. I didn't make the second groove because I want to anticipate how far in I intend to go with making this channel, this first channel. So I'm using the pillar file to then deepen that and follow that groove I made. I will use that pillar file's edge to sharpen up the end so that it's a nice, crisp, sharp drop into the channel. And once I've got the other channel started and I'm satisfied with where it's laid out, I will then start with the round file to make the second channel that I want to start working on. And when I feel comfortable that that little starter channel is deep enough, I switch to the pillar file and start digging in there to create the second channel. And again, I'm looking from behind the camera, so The files are not always exactly perpendicular, which would be normal if I didn't have a camera in front of my face, but I did the best I could. So I'm just finishing up the outer channel and cleaning it up to make it the depth I want, and then going back to the second channel and trying to make that match the first one as far as its width and depth. I think it's important to note when you're working with files like this, keep the file moving. If you keep it still for too long, you're going to create unnecessary wear and tear on your file. So I'm going to clean it up with the sandpaper, and I will try to get into those channels that I made in the pin to smooth those out, and did a little test there of the ends to make sure that I didn't have anything that needed to be addressed or worked on or filed off. And I'm just finishing up sanding the actual channels themselves. And basically, it gets time to cut it off. I use the jeweler saw. Careful where you place this, because that will be how the tip or other end of your pin is. And we'll cut that one free. Now, serrated spool pins, they're not too terribly more difficult than just making a standard spool pin. So what it boils down to is think of a standard spool pin and just make sure that the two end sections on your spool are wide enough to actually throw a serration into them. Or quite frankly, if you want to make them wide enough to add a couple of serrations, you could make it even more complicated that way. It takes a little bit more eyeballing and finesse, but you can do it. There's lots of different variations you can make with this. For that matter, if you really wanted to get tricky, you could throw some serrations on the channel inside the spool. Don't know how much that's going to engage in the lock, but if you wanted to get fancy, I suppose you could do that. But I try to make my serrations on the ends of spools a bit deeper, because I really, and then try to make sure that there's portions on that are sharp. So in the case of this pin that I'm making here, I I did use the kerf saw to create the serrations, and that gives you an incredible amount of control where you place the serration on your pin. And I added the second serration on the inside of the pin. And unfortunately for this video, I had completely forgotten about sanding the pin. So I was trying to get through and do these videos and totally forgot about doing that. But so I cut away this pin. Be careful where you place the saw, of course. Again, it likes to skip around when you first lay down there, so make sure before you put any kind of pressure on there, it's set where you want it. Let it eat a bit. Once it starts making a channel, then you can apply a little bit more pressure and let it eat a little bit better, but definitely go back and forth with that. And then finally, serrated spool pins. Again, just like a double spool, you're going to create a double spool, and you're going to put serrations on the outer portions of that spool. Again, you can be creative and do whatever you like, add multiple serrations on each section, but there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. Obviously, if you want to get really complicated and make, triple spools, and you're going to have to be very careful about how long you make your pin and whether it's going to work as a driver pin anymore. But I have made even key pins into spools, serrated spools, and you can do whatever you like as long as you can get it in the chuck and your Dremel. You're good to go. So again, just like a normal double spool, I'm creating the two channels I intend to use. I am then going to use the pillar file to deepen and square off those channels. And once that is done, I will be able to create the serrations on the pin. So here I am finishing off the second channel. I want them to be as even as possible so that they're as close to the same as I can get, you know, just eyeballing it. Now, of course, I'm going through and making all these pins, and I'm not, I wouldn't say rushing through, but I am going a lot faster because I'm doing this for the purposes of these videos and trying to keep them as short as possible. But you have all the time in the world. If you're making a pin, you can stop and start the Dremel as many times as you like and make your perfect pins however you want. Take your time, enjoy the creative part of making these. It's actually a lot of fun. I do a lot of pin therapy, so to speak, and I enjoy making these challenge lock pins. I have many of them to choose from when I'm creating challenge locks, as I'm sure many other challenge lock makers do themselves as well. I will say one final thing. When I'm making challenge locks, I do make pins just for that lock, so I will take and do those types of custom ones last. Usually those are the key pins. But so this pin, again, I forgot to do the sanding, my bad. I'm going to cut this pin off, call it good, and call it a serrated spool, serrated double spool. And thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the content in this episode. If you are currently a subscriber, thank you. If you are not yet a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications and all, and hit like on the video. And thank you for watching.